Part 1.
You'll hear a lecturer talking to students about the museum service. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 3. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 3.
Good afternoon. So far, in these lectures, we've been looking at the management of public services and the ways in which they try to improve. Today, I want to look at the museum service, since it's a very good example of the kind of service that everyone says they want, in theory, but which in practice often has to work with limited budgets. The key aim of most museums today is to make themselves more effective. In the past, a museum might simply collect and organize old objects and display them in glass cabinets. Often, these displays didn't change from one year to the next and simply got bigger as the museum bought more exhibits. However, falling numbers of visits to museums taught managers that bigger wasn't necessarily better and that museums had to adapt to deal with a changing world. Museums have learned that they need to offer a greater variety of services for people in their local area to choose between. They also need to reach as wide an audience as possible and need to find innovative ways of getting people through the door who we perhaps wouldn't think of as traditional museum visitors, children, for example, or people from various ethnic backgrounds. Museum managers often don't have the funding to do very much about the buildings they manage, but they can do a lot about the experience of visiting those buildings. A lot depends on the staff, of course, however big or small the team running the museum may be. But there are also relationships outside the museum which have a large effect. Rather than work alone, good museums these days work very closely with local councils and businesses.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 4 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 4 to 10.
These relationships can be quite complicated, and it's important to understand the different responsibilities. Most museums find that there are things that are the direct responsibility of staff, such as planning and designing new public displays, and there are things that they need outside help for. I'd like to go on to consider some of these areas. Museums have for a long time complained of a lack of funding. They're often not at the top of the list when it comes to local councils deciding what to do with their money. This has led to museums seeking alternative sources, and the local business community has been a valuable partner. More often than not these days, you'll see that an exhibition is sponsored by a business that has some connection to the subject. Their logo will appear on any promotional material that the museum produces to advertise its events, such as leaflets and ads in the local press. Museums also can't afford to see themselves in isolation from the local community, and that obviously involves knowing exactly who the local community is. In most museums, the staff themselves will come from the town or city where the museum is located and should have some knowledge of the needs of local people. However, they will usually rely heavily on studies done by the local council, which tell them what people want from their museum service. Once they have that information, it's then up to the staff to decide how they're going to get the people of the area more involved in the museum, either as visitors or even possibly as volunteers. Apart from the exhibitions, museums provide a whole range of activities, including things like talks or workshops on subjects that local people may be interested in. The museum staff probably lack the expertise to talk on many subjects, and so it usually means inviting speakers from different places, possibly even from different countries. This is exactly the kind of thing that museums will try to do in partnership with companies from the local area, who are often willing to pay for speakers if their brand name is displayed at the event. Museums, of course, need various well-maintained buildings. It's important that people can access the museum services easily and comfortably, and it will usually be the local authorities who are responsible for that. This funding is, of course, ultimately provided by local people through their taxes.
That is the end of part 1.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 2.
Part 2.
You will hear part of an introductory talk about a library. Listen and answer questions 11 to 15. You will hear part of an introductory talk about a library. Listen and answer questions 11 to 15.
Good morning. My name is Mandy, and I am going to tell you a little about the John R. Jones Memorial Library here at Blackwater College. We regard the library as a gateway to the resources that you, as students at the college, may need. The majority of you are full-time students. You may find you spend a lot of time here. Even those of you who are part-time students will no doubt require the services too. I hope that by the end of this short talk you will know the services the library has to offer, including the website and how to get any further help you may need. Oh, sorry, I forgot there may be a few distance learners on the tour today. I'll explain about the online facilities and borrowing by post scheme a little later on. This is the main site of the library, but we also have the Rivergate building and the Fieldhouse Library. The Rivergate building houses the geography resources, that is the book collection and the journal collection, as well as the map collection. The hours and days of opening of the Rivergate collection are the same as this building, except that it is closed on Christmas Day and New Year's Day. The Fieldhouse Library contains a specialist collection of local history, and if you want to visit it, you will need to make an appointment. Those two facilities are the only exceptions to the rule that all the Blackwater College libraries are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. However, to gain access to the facilities, you must have your ID card. No ID card, no entry. We have heard all the stories and excuses, and we don't accept any of them. Just remember your ID card.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 16 to 20.
Now, I must apologise for the mess you can see around you today. Libraries should be quiet
listen and
places,
answer
but
questions
unfortunately
16 to
this is
20.
not currently the case here. This new building has been here for only 2 months, and as a result, we have not quite finished moving in. So far, we have moved most of the book and journal collections from the old library into this new building. There are 2 exceptions. We are currently moving the economics collection here, which should be installed by tomorrow, and we will be moving the French literature collection into this building next week. But as you can see, we are still building the new restaurant. We will finish it, we hope, very shortly. We have finished the cafe, however, and students can use it during the library opening hours. We have recently installed 150 computer places, and we will be adding another 100 shortly, so that there will be plenty for everybody very soon. Very shortly, this library will be one of the finest in this part of the country. Don't forget that the library isn't just about academic books. In addition to the books and journals, there is a wide range of national newspapers available from the librarians on request. I'd like to mention the different ways you can get help in using our resources. Don't forget our website at www.mlbc.ac.uk. There are the full catalogues, and journal access is available if you have your password and ID number. Now, any questions?
That is the end of part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 3. Part 3.
First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 26.
Good evening, and welcome to this month's Observatory Club lecture. I'm Donald Mackey, and I'm here to talk to you about the solar eclipse in history. 1,000 years ago, a total eclipse of the sun was a terrifying religious experience. But these days, an eclipse is more likely to be viewed as a tourist attraction than as a scientific or spiritual event. People will travel literally miles to be in the right place at the right time to get the best view of their eclipse. Well, what exactly causes a solar eclipse? When the world goes dark for a few minutes in the middle of the day. Scientifically speaking, the dark spot itself is easy to explain. It is the shadow of the moon streaking across the earth. This happens every year or two, each time along a different and, to all intents and purposes, a seemingly random piece of the globe. In the past, people often interpreted an eclipse as a danger signal heralding disaster and in fact, the Chinese were so disturbed by these events that they included among their gods one whose job was to prevent eclipses. But whether or not you are superstitious or take a purely scientific view, our earthly eclipses are special in three ways. Firstly, there can be no doubt that they are very beautiful. It's as if a deep blue curtain had fallen over the daytime sky as the sun becomes a black void surrounded by the glow of its outer atmosphere. But beyond this, total eclipses possess a second, more compelling beauty in the eyes of us scientists, for they offer a unique opportunity for research. Only during an eclipse can we study the corona and other dim things that are normally lost in the sun's glare. And thirdly, they are rare. Even though an eclipse of the sun occurs somewhere on Earth every year or two, if you sit in your garden and wait, it will take 375 years on average for one to come to you. If the moon were any larger, eclipses would become a monthly bore. If it were smaller, they simply would not be possible. The ancient Babylonian priests, who spent a fair bit of time staring at the sky, had already noted that there was an 18-year pattern in their recurrence, but they didn't have the mathematics to predict an eclipse accurately.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 27 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 27 to 30.
It was Edmund Halley, the English astronomer, who knew his maths well enough to predict the return of the comet, which incidentally bears his name, and in 1715 he became the first person to make an accurate eclipse prediction. This brought eclipses firmly into the scientific domain, and they have since allowed a number of important scientific discoveries to be made. For instance, in the eclipse of 1868, two scientists, Janssen and Lockyer, were observing the sun's atmosphere, and it was these observations that ultimately led to the discovery of a new element. They named the element helium after the Greek god of the sun. This was a major find because helium turned out to be the most common element in the universe after hydrogen. Another great triumph involved mercury. I'll just put that up on the board for you now. See, there's Mercury, the planet closest to the sun. Then there's Venus, Earth, etc. For centuries, scientists had been unable to understand why Mercury appeared to rotate faster than it should. Some astronomers suggested that there might be an undiscovered planet causing this unusual orbit, and even gave it the name Vulcan. During the eclipse of 1878, an American astronomer, James Watson, thought he had spotted this so-called lost planet. But alas for him, he was later obliged to admit that he had been wrong about Vulcan and withdrew his claim. Then Albert Einstein came on the scene. Einstein suggested that rather than being wrong about the number of planets, astronomers were actually wrong about gravity. Einstein's theory of relativity, for which he is so famous, disagreed with Newton's law of gravity in just the right way to explain Mercury's odd orbit. He also realized that a definitive test would be possible during the total eclipse of 1919, and this is indeed when his theory was finally proved correct. So there you have several examples of how eclipses have helped to increase our understanding of the universe. And now let's move on to social.
That is the end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to to check your answers.
Now turns to Part 4.
Part 4.
You will hear a woman giving a talk at a popular science convention. She is describing research into artificial gills designed to enable humans to breathe underwater. Now you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen and answer questions 31 to 40.
In my talk today, I'll be exploring the idea of artificial gills. I'll start by introducing the concept, giving some background and so forth, and then I'll go on to explain the technological applications, including a short, very simple experiment I conducted. Starting with the background. As everyone knows, all living creatures need oxygen to live. Mammals take in oxygen from the atmosphere by using their lungs, and fishes take oxygen from water by means of their gills, which of course in most fishes are located either side of their head. But human beings have always dreamt of being able to swim underwater like the fishes, breathing without the help of oxygen tanks. I don't know whether any of you have done any scuba diving, but it's a real pain having to use all that equipment. You need special training, and it's generally agreed that tanks are too heavy and big to enable most people to move and work comfortably underwater. So scientists are trying a different tack. Rather than humans carrying an oxygen supply as they go underwater, wouldn't it be possible to extract oxygen in situ? That is, directly from the water while swimming. In the 1960s, the famous underwater explorer Jacques Cousteau, for example, predicted that one day surgery could be used to equip humans with gills. He believed our lungs could be bypassed and we would learn to live underwater just as naturally as we live on land. But of course, most of us would prefer not to go to such extremes. I've been looking at some fairly simple technologies developed to extract oxygen from water, ways to produce a simple, practical artificial gill, enabling humans to live and breathe in water without harm. Now, how scientists and inventors went about this was to look at the way different animals handled this. Fairly obviously, they looked at the way fishes breathe, but also how they move down and float up to the surface using inflatable sacs called swim bladders. Scientists also looked at animals without gills, which use bubbles of air underwater, notably beetles. These insects contrive to stay underwater for long periods by breathing from this bubble, which they hold under their wing cases. By looking at these animal adaptations, inventors began to come up with their own artificial gills. Now, making a crude gill is actually rather easy, more straightforward. You take a watertight box, which is made of a material which is permeable to gas, that is, it allows it to pass through inwards and outwards. You then fill this with air, fix it to the diver's face, and go down underwater. But a crucial factor is that the diver has to keep the water moving so that water high in oxygen is always in contact with the gill, so he can't really stay still. And to maximize this contact, it's necessary for your gill to have a big surface area. Different gill designers have addressed this problem in different ways, but many choose to use a network or lattice arrangement of tiny tubes as part of their artificial gills. Then the diver is able to breathe in and out. Oxygen from the water passes through the outer walls of the gill, and carbon dioxide is expelled. In a nutshell, that's how the artificial gill works. So, having read about these simple gill mechanisms, I decided to create my own. I followed the procedure I've just described, and it worked pretty well when I tried it out in the swimming pool. I lasted underwater for nearly 40 minutes. However, I've read about other people breathing through their gill for several hours. So the basic idea works well, but the real limitation is that these simple gills don't work as the diver descends to any great depth because the pressure builds and a whole different set of problems are caused by that. Research is being done into how these problems might be overcome, but that's another story, which has to be a subject of another talk. Despite this serious limitation, many people have high hopes for the artificial gill, and they think it might have applications beyond simply enabling an individual to stay underwater for a length of time. For example, the same technology might be used to provide oxygen for submarines, enabling them to stay submerged for months on end without resorting to potentially dangerous technologies such as nuclear power. Another idea is to use oxygen derived from the water as energy for fuel cells. These could power machinery underwater, such as robotic devices. So, in my view, this is an area of technology with great potential. Now, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Yes, lady at the...
That is the end of part 4.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.